Hey everybody, let's finally get into community property. So before we dive into this complicated topic of community property, let's go through a very brief foundation of what it means, and then we'll get into the nitty-gritty of what community property actually means. So let's finally get into the introduction of it. I wrote a very brief outline in regards to what we'll talk about for the introduction. We'll go through the definition of marriage, the definition of separate and apart when the spouses decide to do so. We'll talk about separate property, community property, and then we will conclude and talk about the topic that we'll talk about next. The definition of what a valid marriage means under the law is basically boiled down to two elements. We need legal capacity and legal formalities. Two people with legal capacity is two people who are age of consent, which means that they're 18 years old or older, and they have the ability, the cognitive ability to understand the consequences of marriage. And legal formalities means that there's some type of ceremony involved between the spouses and they have a license from the state. So their marriage is recognized by the state. They have some type of ceremony in regards to this marriage. They have the ability to comprehend what they're doing in regards to getting married, and they're the age of consent, 18 years old or older. That is what marriage means under the law. Community property is very straightforward. Very straightforward. Community property means that it's all property acquired during marriage by the labor, skills, or efforts of either spouse will constitute community property. So let's just say that Jane and John are married. John becomes an attorney 1 year later and he's making six figures. The money that he's making will be considered community property because he earned that money during marriage. But let's say that John owned a home before he got married to Jan. That house that John bought before he married Jan is his separate property because he received and he got that house before marriage, not during marriage. Community property is equally divided between both spouses. So they're basically equally owned by each spouse, which means that if they get divorced, if the marriage dissolves, all the property, all the community property, will be divided 50-50. Another example of this is that let's say in 2021, Riley and Israel get married. Riley then gets a raise at his job. In 2022, Riley buys a truck with the community funds that he ended up getting from his raise at his job. That truck will be considered community property because he got that raise during the marriage and he used that money to buy that truck during their marriage. That's why the truck will be considered community property rather than a separate property. There are only 11 community property states in the country. As you can see, Wisconsin, Washington, Idaho, Nevada, California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and Louisiana. Otherwise, every other state do not they don't recognize community property law. They basically go by family law when it comes down to dividing property and what belongs to whom when it comes down to marriage and divorce. Separate property, very straightforward in the law. Separate property means that it is property acquired before marriage, after separation of the spouses, and property acquired by bequest, basically acquired by will, or gift, which means that let's say your mother gives you a gift for your birthday, that is going to constitute a gift and that will be separate property. So an example of this is that let's just say in 2022, Julia and Brian get married. Julia's dad bequests his home to her when he died. So he died that same year. His will bequested his home to her. Because the house was bequested to Julia through his will, through her dad's will, the house will be considered separate property, and Brian will have no rights to that home. So even if they get divorced and he wants half of that home, can't get it because it was through a bequest. Therefore, that is her separate property. He has no rights. So let's go through separate and apart. Separate and apart is pretty straightforward here. Let's go through the general rule. Under the law, separate and apart means that when spouses have no present intention of resuming their marital relations, and the spouse's conduct is evidence that they are truly complete and separate from one another. Basically, it's evidence that, hey, they're not only talking about it, it's not just words, their conduct and their intent demonstrates that they truly want to end the marriage and they are separate and apart. An example of this, and let's just say in 2022, Austin and Samantha got married. The following year, in 2023, Samantha cheated on Austin. Austin moved out, started dating other women, and did not attend events with Samantha. This is clear they are separated apart because Austin not only moved out of the home and he wants to get a divorce, but his actions, his conduct demonstrates that the intent of being separated apart from Samantha is genuine because he started dating other women and he didn't attend similar events with her. Therefore, through his actions, not just his words, he's demonstrating that they are truly separated apart. Therefore, the law would recognize Austin and Samantha being separate apart at this point. Overall conclusion is that separate property is when property was acquired before marriage and after separation. Also, bequest, devise, gift, or descent. Community property is earned during marriage. So again, if you're a law student and you get married during law school, then you become that big time lawyer in Los Angeles making $1 million a year while you're married. That's all community property, dude. So too bad to you, man, if you get divorced, because that's all community property. You can't say that's your separate property because, again, you earned that money while you were married, not before you were married. The next lesson, we'll go through the general and special presumptions, which is very, very critical when it comes down to the bar exam and also applying this to your final exam for your community property class. So we'll go through that next. Thank you. If you have any questions, comment below, and I'll be able to answer any question you may have.